Now, Downing Street has ruled out the idea of an army draft, for now at least, after a top army official warned that Britons could face conscription if the country was to find itself at war.
Well, that's as Tory MP Tobias Ellwood said the current state of world politics is reminiscent of 1939 due to the ongoing conflict in both the Middle East and Ukraine.
Well, in the meantime, NATO has begun its biggest military exercise since the Cold War, with 90,000 troops mobilising to show the world it can defend its territory against a potential attack from Russia.
So, should the UK be preparing for World War III? Well, joining us now is the Defence Editor of Evening Standard, Robert Fox. Very good morning to you, Robert. So we're looking at the front page of the Daily Telegraph this morning, aren't we, the two of us?
Had a good run on this story.
Yes.
Got leaks from the army. Caught number 10 out. Yep. It's
well, they wanted this all to be kept under wraps, didn't they?
Yeah, the story behind the story is fascinating here. And I'm afraid to say I don't think the Prime Minister is entirely in the clear. Because he knows jolly well that a lot of ministries and advisers have been considering this because there aren't enough men and women and men in public service, security services. Up until very recently, all three major services, armed services, were losing more than they were recruiting. And this is the era of, new bit of jargon, of polycrises, of multiple crises coming, as they say when in sentencing, concurrently. And this has been shown up by the requirement for this exercise. It's 20,000 British personnel have been put towards it, but it is only an exercise. The requirements in the Gulf, they've got something going off on Guyana. What happens if something else is happening, and indeed it is, across Syria, Iraq, where US-led bases are being attacked, but there are British personnel in them as well. So how are we going to manage it? But getting some public buy-in to possibly a short-term form of national service has been discussed by our chiefs, and they've been looking at models in Scandinavia, particularly Norway and Sweden, and above all, Finland. And NATO allies are going to be asked to think about this very subject at their major 75th anniversary summit coming up this summer.
But we've got to be careful, haven't we? Because General Sir Patrick Sanders, who sort of sparked all this, hasn't actually said conscription, has he? He's just said civilians need to be prepared.
There are 3 or 4 words which you cannot use, and this is what the PM is steering around. Conscription, national service, call-up, compulsion. It's had a very bad history through the 20th century. They only in World War I got round to it in 1916. It was very controversial. Big call-out, much more consensus, more or less, in World War II, but then a great deal of difficulty as the empire wound down, a vast area with national service troops, servicemen. It was servicemen, largely, in those days, finally abandoned in 1959. And Sir Patrick should be reminded who was most against the culture? The army commandos. And I think that this is a problem. But it's very interesting that he did this speech, which was to be given behind closed-ish doors at an army vehicle demonstration and exhibition. It was leaked to the Daily Telegraph. Somebody must have approved of that speech. They must have known what was coming up. And the PM's spokesman, I understand, said, no, the PM doesn't agree with Sir Patrick Sanders, but oh boy, PM and Leader of the Opposition, this one is coming up big time.
I mean, no existing policies currently spell out how the UK would mobilise a force that would be big enough to take on Russia. Do you think we're going to hear a lot more about
I don't think it's really about taking on Russia, by the way.
Well, it'll be China and Iran.
Well, the trouble is they keep on talking about 1912 or 1914 or 1939. It's not like that, because the era of industrial war is over. It's much more polycrises. We should also be thinking about COVID's, weird weather. 750,000 people volunteered once we went into lockdown with COVID. They didn't know really what to do with them. It's organising public service across the piece. And as somebody said, a very senior military person actually serving said, what we're really looking for is to incentivise young people for volunteer public service, which could be paid and promoted. And that's where they're looking, particularly at places like Norway, the Danes, the Dutch, as I say, But the Norwegian chief of staff, they give them scholarships almost for things, for their elite forces. They can't get them out again once they've called up because it's a good employer.
So do we need to... Because the problem with all of this is, and the language that are being used and the way it's been promoted in the papers and all the rest of it, is it's stoking fears of World War III.
Exactly.
But that's not the case then, is it?
It's going to be difficult because Russia is in bed with very strange bedfellows, namely Iran and North Korea, and what is it up to? And I think the warnings from the Scandinavians, above all the Baltics, about this aggressive posture of Putin is well worth having. But look at how he's struggling in Ukraine. He's not going to conquer Western Europe. And that's where I think the analogies, the language is absolutely wrong. But what I think this will come up in one form or another in the general election campaign.